And I know that there are a number of people who are here tonight who've come to all three of this series. It's like a graduate school course in film and film history, don't you think? Yeah. I know I spent a couple of days after watching High Noon thinking about that film and its place in our film history and in our country's history. Nina has put all these lectures together herself. She is, as you may know, a veteran of Hollywood. She worked there for a number of years and then switched careers and moved to our beautiful valley. So she stepped forward and has volunteered to put these programs on, and we're really, really grateful for what she has done for us. So I'm just going to stop talking and invite you to welcome Nina Kleinberg for our third film in the series of classic American Westerns. Please join me.
Good evening, and welcome to the third and final installment of Print the Legend, Classic American Westerns. And you all know the drill. I've done it before, so I'm going to encourage you to turn off your cell phones. And for those of you who have not been here before, you know that these movies take place at the end of the 19th century, and the only acceptable ways to communicate are with smoke signals or the Pony Express or the telegraph. You're going to find tonight's film, The Searchers, at or near the top of every list on the internet about the best Westerns. It's for the filmmakers of my generation. This was the film that taught us how to make movies outdoors and how to choreograph action. It is also, let's start up front, a challenging and at times deeply troubling film for today's audience. The main character is blatantly racist, and whether you consider him to be the hero, the anti-hero, depends on your willingness to see this film as a product of its time and place, and quite frankly, to think about how you feel about John Wayne. There is blatant misogyny and fat shaming. They're played for laughs. In the past 2 weeks, we followed the Westerns as they matured from those odors, those horse operas, those B pictures made to fill in the second half of a double bill. And then we followed them into the adult Westerns with very complex themes about violence and morality and honor. So let's take a look at what was happening in the film industry and in Westerns in the 1950s. We'll talk a bit about the depiction of Native Americans in films, and we're also going to look a little bit at the story behind this film. A story a little more nuanced and I think equally as enthralling as the story in today's film. Now, the biggest threat to the movie industry and box office receipts in the early 1950s was a different kind of box. It was this box, this little box. In 1949, there were maybe 1 million TV sets in the country. Within 2 decades, 96% of households had them. And the most popular form of entertainment in this little box were Westerns. In the late 50s, 8 out of 10 of everyone's favorite shows were Westerns, and in 1959, there were 30 different Westerns on TV at a time when there were only 3 major channels. And there were gunfighter Westerns and wagon train, well, you get the idea. There were all kinds. So return with me now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
The Lone Ranger. Happy trails to you until we meet again. starring James Arnett as Matt Dillon.
Moving, moving, moving. Oh, they're just a moving. Keep them doggies moving.
Now, all of these westerns were constrained by a few things. First of all, there was the aspect ratio of TV, and an aspect ratio is the division between the height and the width. And TV screens weren't exactly square; they were a little wider than they were tall. But given the current state of TV technology, they were all in this confined shape, and they were all in black and white up until Bonanza started in color in 1960. Now, with the advent of TV, movie box office receipts started to drop off, and within a few short years, there was the movie theaters responded by taking this very small screen. They brought you CinemaScope and Cinerama and VistaVision, and they filmed in color and stereo sound. Westerns with their vast panoramas, this was the ideal genre for this new way of overcoming people's reluctance to leave their homes. Now, there's a common framework of understanding when you look at Westerns, and that includes everyone assumed, the people who were making these films, that the land belongs to the white Europeans who settle it. The settlers are brave, independent, they defend themselves with guns, their violence is justified. On the other hand, Native Americans, they're not us, they're an impediment to our progress. They have their tribes, but they're definitely not part of our tribe. They are barbaric, their violence is not justified, and it's going to take a while, but inevitably we are going to win. And we are going to Christianize and civilize the Native Americans. When we had our first talk a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the time right when the movie camera was being invented, where there was already nostalgia for the dying West. And some of the very first images captured on film by Edison were taken of Native Americans who performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. You also had early silent films that had in their cast all genuine Native Americans telling their own stories. Here's a wonderful film that was recently rediscovered and redigitized by the Oklahoma Historical Society. It's the story of a love affair between two Native Americans. There's no white people in this picture. And I want you to look at these folks because we're going to come back to them later, the actors in this film. Then, of course, you move on to stories by Zane Grey. You talk about Native Americans. It's too bad they had to lose the war. had the noble savage, the dying race, outnumbered after millennia of living freely. The other roles that Native Americans took place were the same kind of roles that all non-white people took. They were often used for comic relief. And we saw that in Red River a couple weeks ago when Chief Yaulachi won Walter Brennan's teeth in the poker game. That was strictly played for laughs. Here's an early silent film where the Native Americans are definitely played for laughs. But for the most part, and especially after 1939, this is what you usually saw when you saw Native Americans. Native Americans were seen as the other, an alien race, and essentially what we did was we went on a program of ethnic cleansing. The Searchers is filled with underlying currents, not only of these attitudes towards Native Americans, but also with forbidden lust, obsession with female sexual purity, and fears of miscegenation. Now, it was nominally okay for a white man to have sex with a Native woman. But for European women, having sex with a Native man, what was that? It was seen as the fate worse than death. And if it happened, a woman was expected to want to die. This is such a well-known trope throughout movie history that it was referenced without ever being spoken about. And let me give you an idea. I'm going to show you a very early film from 1913 shot by D.W. Griffith, who also brought us Birth of a Nation. Everybody in the audience knew what that gun was for. It was to kill the virgin before she could be ravished. You'll notice he's not pointing it at the head of the older woman, but rather at the young, pure virgin. And you see it again in that old chestnut Stagecoach. And again, notice he's pointing the gun at the head of the properly married lady and not at the whore with the heart of gold. Another great movie from 1950, Winchester 73. Jimmy Stewart and Shelley Winters are about to fend off or try to fend off an Indian attack.
Just in case you,
I know how to use it. I understand about the last one.
Yeah, she knows what the last bullet's for. And the Coen brothers, just last year, used this trope in their film, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs.
If I see we're licked, I'm going to shoot you and then I'm going to shoot myself, so that's okay. But if you see that I'm done for, well, you're going to have to do for yourself. Now you put it right there so you can't miss.
No.
This is businessmen all about. They catch you, it won't be so good. After they take off every stitch of your clothes and have the way where they'll stretch you out with a rawhide, and then they'll drive a stake through the middle of your body into the ground, and then they'll do some other things, and we can't have that.
Throughout the film tonight, this theme dominates. Now, the enemy, who are the enemy in this film tonight?
Keep on going.
They are the Comanche. And just a brief word about who the Comanche were. They ruled a large part of North America for over 200 years. They had fended off Spanish conquistadors, Mexicans, other Native American tribes, the Texicans, the U.S. cavalry with unprecedented success. Their warrior culture was based here in Comancheria, and it was dangerous to go anywhere into Comancheria if you were not part of their tribe, even if you were another group of Native Americans. Their culture was based on the horse, so it was a relatively new culture since there were no horses in North America before the Europeans came. A Comanche warrior could ride his horse bareback, hands-free, and fire off 10 arrows with incredible precision, while a U.S. cavalry member had shot his rifle once and was busy reloading. The Comanche never signed a treaty, and their 40-year battle with the United States was the longest war ever fought on U.S. soil. The plot of tonight's movie, The Searchers, was based on a book by this man, Alan LeMay, and it told a story that is very familiar to this day, especially in Texas, about a young girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old. Her name was Cynthia Ann Parker. Her families were early settlers in what at that point was the Texas Republic. They had built a stronghold in Comanche territory named Parker's Fort. And in 1836, Parker's Fort was raided and destroyed by the Comanche. Most of the people were killed. Cynthia Ann was at that point 9 or 10 years old, and she and her 5 companions were abducted. The other 5 were either ransomed or killed, but Cynthia Ann stayed with the Comanches for 25 years. She was adopted into their band. She married. She had 3 kids, and basically forgot most of her English. Her Uncle James' partner made several forays into Comanche territory trying to find her. He is the person who was the searcher, but he eventually gave up and went home. And it wasn't until 1860 when the cavalry attacked what was basically a campsite of women and children and old people. They were in the process of slaughtering everyone. I've just lost my light. There it's back. They were in the process of slaughtering everyone when Cynthia Ann stood up and said, "Americano." Yeah, and they looked at her, she had blue eyes, and they recognized her as Cynthia Ann. From their point of view, she was being rescued. From her point of view, it was a second kidnapping. More about Cynthia Ann after the movie tonight. You will find The Searchers. You are going to find The Searchers, as I said, again, I don't have a light. You are going to find The Searchers on the list of every great movies. The American Film Institute calls it the absolute best Western ever made and the 12th best film ever made. The British Film Institute and Sight and Sound ranks it number 7 of the best films of all time. For those of us growing up in the 50s, and this was the very first Western that we saw that took advantage of that widescreen format. It was the movie that filmmakers of my generation, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, loved this film. Jean-Luc Godard thought it was brilliant. New York Magazine called it the most influential film in American history. It's also one of the first films to take a good hard look at European racism and sexual terror. It was directed by the great John Ford, who is routinely regarded as probably the greatest director of Westerns. He had gotten his start in silent days, directing The Iron Horse, which was an epic about building the Transcontinental Railway. And 17 years before The Searcher, he had made, again, that iconic film, Stagecoach. From 1948 to 1950, he directed John Wayne in 3 very highly regarded Westerns about the Indian Wars, known as the Cavalry Trilogy. Fort Apache treats the natives with great respect. By the end, in Rio Grande, not so much. His depiction of Native Americans varied widely from one film to another. I'm going to show you a clip from a film he made in 1950, which shows an interaction between Native Americans and white people, which I kind of hope was the way most of those interactions went.
He's inviting us to their camp tonight.
Tell him we'll be there.
Yes, Ikis.
These are Mormons traveling west. It's kind of sweet. I love this scene. This film is shot, like so many of John Ford's Westerns, in Monument Valley, and if you have never been there, put it on your bucket list. I've been there many times, and it's really spectacular. His first film shot in Monument Valley was, once again, Stagecoach. Shot during the Depression, the Navajos welcomed John Ford. He hired hundreds of Navajo performers and crew. He brought hundreds of thousands of dollars into their community at a time when they were suffering the effects of the Depression. And later in his career, when he worked with them, he insisted on paying them the same as the white crew and actors, which was almost unheard of in labor relations. The Navajo even made him a member of their tribe, an honorary member, and they still revere him today. For most white American filmmakers, however, Indians are Indians. There's no recognition of their many different tribes and cultures, and tonight's film is ostensibly about the Comanches. However, the Native Americans in this film are all wearing Navajo dress. They speak Navajo, and Monument Valley is hundreds of miles west of Comancheria. The Searchers was not Ford's first film shot in color. In Monument Valley, that honor goes to She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, but it was his first color film shot there that also made use of that very new widescreen format. In this case, VistaVision. It was only 3 or 4 years since Cinerama and CinemaScope had been brought in. And in shooting The Searchers, Ford and his cinematographer, Winton Hoke, they were inventing a new visual language. You have no idea how astounding these images were. to the audience in 1956. Let's take a look at just a few ways that they use this new aspect ratio. This is a burial scene from early in the film. You have 3 separate areas of interest with the burial almost lost between the livestock in front and the unforgiving rocky wilderness of Monument Valley. You couldn't do this in black and white and TV. Here's another scene from early in the film. You've got 2 separate horizons emphasizing the battle about to begin. And then, of course, you've got this, the most iconic shot in the entire film. As a matter of fact, I have read over 20 articles about this shot alone and what it means for film technique and what it means for Ethan Edwards, the character in this film. And for me, if it does nothing else, it takes the widescreen format and uses it to constrain him, to say that he is perhaps maybe less than he appears. David Lean is said to have watched The Searchers many times in preparation for filming Lawrence of Arabia. And if you see that film after tonight's film, you will see some resemblances. One of the other very interesting things, and we're almost up to talking about the actors and getting on to see the movie, but one of the other interesting things about The Searchers is John Ford personally financed a film about the making of The Searchers. It was the first the making of film that was ever recorded, I think because he was aware of how challenging it was to shoot this kind of spectacle where there had been no roads, no electricity, no running water, no facilities for the crew, and yet they pulled it off.
A grip level subtracts for the camera dolly, a mammoth piece of precision machinery. And here it is, pacing John Wayne and Jeffrey Hunter as they ride by. You'll visit with Monument Valley's friendly Navajos. You'll also see them turned into bloodthirsty Comanche Indians by our makeup men. You'll meet the ladies of the cast, Vera Miles, Natalie Wood, and Olive Carey. And you'll be there riding the camera car through the Indian village as the searchers attack the wild Comanche to get back their stolen women. The climax of a scene that is also the climax of the months of planning and building that go into the production of a picture like The Searchers.
Of course, the star of tonight's film is John Wayne. He was a huge star when this was made. And we can talk about John Wayne and what influence he had, not just in movies, but in how we think about the main character tonight. I think that'll be a good subject for the Q&A at the end of the evening. He is joined in his search by Jeffrey Hunter, who varied between being an A-list and a B-list actor. Also joining them on the search is someone who, if you grew up in the 50s, you knew Ward Bond. He was the star of Wagon Train. The chief enemy, Scar, is played by Henry Brandon, and this was pretty typical that you had a European playing the main role, the major Native American roles. Cynthia Ann, or the Cynthia Ann role, is played by Natalie Wood. She had just finished making Rebel Without a Cause. She was only 18 at the time. And you will see her sister Lana portraying her as a young girl in the beginning of the film. One last shout out to Max Steiner, who wrote tonight's score. He had scored Casablanca, he scored Gone with the Wind. If you saw my talk about Casablanca, you know what a contribution he made to that film. And you will hear his music throughout. It's a combination of recognized Western tunes, a few original songs, and what passed for Native American music. So after the film, we're going to take a quick look at what happened to Westerns in the 60s and 70s, and we'll find out what happened to the real Cynthia Ann and her descendants. But for now, I'm going to ask you to immerse yourself in the 1950s and the Searchers. And if you find this a struggle, consider it a meditation on how far we've come, or maybe we haven't come, since 1956. and now The Searchers.